What fun to be part of both this workshop and this session talking about such important intersectoral issues connecting different topics across the food system. I want to talk for a little while about how conversations about sustainable diets play out differently under conditions of scarcity and abundance. And you're going to see a number of ways in which this reinforces things that Adam and Jessica were talking about. Sustainable diets are inherently multi-sectoral. It requires us to interest in the same forum people who are thinking about public health, nutrition, the environment and climate change, food consumers, supply chains and food waste, farmers and food producers, and people who are worried about poverty reduction. And they're not all thinking the same things or having the same goals. Sustainable diets are contentious. You think about the different forums where issues related to sustainable diets are argued: in dietary guidelines, about food labeling policy, carbon taxes, now there's something controversial, farm subsidies, now there's something controversial, new agricultural technologies such as GMOs, and there's something controversial, agricultural conservation programs, and many, many other topics. Water allocation, for example, especially in the American West. The question I want to ask is, how can these sectors talk to each other? There's a number of places they talk to each other. One that I really, really like is workshops and documents. I think about, why look, there's our own right there. But there's also forums that reach wider numbers of people, such as food labels and eco-labels. These are very valuable for connecting information across different stages of the food marketing chain, in this case from food manufacturers to food consumers. But they also have their own shortcomings and complexity when you think about the number of different factors that need to be taken into consideration for consumers to make use of a diversity of labels like this. Related to eco-labels, you can think about the checklist that put into practice different labeling standards for food safety or for ecology into the actual production practice. This involves checklists that are negotiated between food retailers or buyers or intermediaries who represent them and agricultural producers and the input suppliers. And so these are also contentious, less visible to the public, but are also highly negotiated documents about what should be the standards by which production is conducted. But if you've invited an economist and given him a microphone, we have to talk also about prices. It's widely thought that prices are too thin a signal to be useful, but economists think of them as very robust signals in many ways about what's going on in other sectors of the economy. It's a little like the aperture on a camera oscura, right? Where it seems like it's too little a hole to have much information be passing through it, but it shows the whole picture on the back screen. And so when you think about farmers and what they need to know about what demand is for different types of products under different conditions, from food manufacturers, a lot of that information is contained in prices. And likewise, when you think about what consumers need to know about how much is available coming down the food supply chain, again, a lot of the information is available in prices. Prices have a lot to do with sustainable diets. They indicate how much healthy food costs for consumers, how much revenue farm owners and operators get. Thinking of the wage as a sort of a price on time, how much farm laborers get in wages. And they tell us about the big picture of global scarcity and abundance. Widely, low prices for food, especially healthy food, are in greater favor than high prices. And we can think about the good things that low prices for healthy food give us, things like affordable food for consumers, and others that may be less noticed. But public policy making about conservation, including both programs like the Conservation Reserve Program in the United States, but also the palm oil, decisions in Malaysia about how much palm oil to produce. Conversations about holding land aside from agricultural production are easier to conduct in a low-price environment than in a high-price environment. But simultaneously, many other conversations play out in a more difficult way when prices are low and better when prices are high. Think about how easy or difficult is it to provide livelihoods for farmers? How strong is the economic incentive to prevent food waste? Or how much investments will there be in alternatives to traditional meat products? Each of these are facilitated by a high price environment. So the thesis of this talk is that conversations about sustainable diets play out differently in low price environments and in high price environments, and we need to be braced for both. I think about this rally. This is a photograph I took of this rally of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers rallying for better wages, of course. The question is not that they're rallying for better wages, for better piece rate on the tomatoes that they harvest. That stands to reason. The question is, why are they wearing coats? Why are they wearing winter coats? Why is this in New York City in March rather than in Florida, where the weather's more pleasant? And the reason has to do in a way with prices. In my teaching, I have my students do role-playing exercises that requires them to think through what is their theory of price transmission. And people, by and large, think to themselves, I didn't know I needed a theory of price transmission. But everybody who cares about sustainable diets needs a theory of price transmission. If you play the role of a farmer advocating for higher piece rate on the tomatoes that you harvest, you have to be thinking about what is economically feasible for the grower. Now, tomato growers in Florida are in a competitive business where they can claim with complete credibility that it's very difficult for them to agree to higher wages because they are prevented by competitive pressures from passing that that cost gain down the food marketing chain. Whereas by contrast, the large companies that use tomatoes in fast foods or in retail chains, they are more able to absorb essentially the penalty of a higher wage. And so if you are thinking about the economics as being part of your vision of what a sustainable diet is, and you want everybody to have a reasonable livelihood, you have to be thinking about under what circumstances can cost changes be passed down the food marketing chain, such as the very clever, wise, astute decision the Coalition of Immokalee Workers makes to focus on the downstream buyers. So if prices are so important, what is the history of food prices? We need to know a little about how wildly different the price setting has been in the last 6 decades. We have in the 1970s the oil price crisis, and there was also sort of weather and other production problems during that period that led to a sharp price spike. And then we have the recent price spikes of 2008 and 2011. So let's talk a little sort of narrowing in on just the last 30 years and think about what's going on. We have a long period of productivity growth and trade. And as an economist, I think it's amusing to say, yeah, trade isn't all bad. Economists tend to think of trade as pretty good most of the time. So we have a long period of productivity growth in agriculture and trade associated with a fairly low price environment, so long that people forgot to worry any longer about scarcity. And then we had changes in the agricultural economy, including increased use of food stocks for biofuels, right? Taking the stocks off of the food supply that's available for humans to consume. And then also notice 2 things. Notice not just prices rising, but notice the change in how chaotic the prices are. This has to do with the highly effective economics of being able to smooth out scarcity and abundance from one year to the next, so long as there's enough agricultural stocks in the system. But if you have several years of low harvest and high demand, the agricultural stocks in the supply chain start to decrease until they hit the point where they can no longer adjust smoothly from one year to the next. And then you have these sudden price spikes, which are associated with riots in developing country capitals and a lot of fear all around the world. But that's not the end of the story. When prices come back down, all of a sudden you have everybody worrying again about overproduction, excessive abundance, and low prices, making it difficult to have adequate livelihoods for farmers, right? So we need to be worried about both types of conditions, high prices and low prices. What we really want to know isn't the history, but the future. Now, USDA has a committee that has to produce essentially official projections about what's going to happen to food prices and other agricultural variables over the course of subsequent years. This is not quite like their guess prognosticating what's going to happen in the future. It's a little more mechanistic than that. It's under certain assumptions. This would be the prices that would be associated with it. And you can see that their guess for the next several decades for key row crops is in the middle. So it's neither so low as it was in the 1990s and 2000s, nor is it so high as the price spikes. You can also see that they have prices no longer jumping around very much, right? So you can take this with a grain of salt in a way. Because meat and the protein category is going to be much discussed over the rest of this day and the next, you have to think the same thing about beef and chicken prices and hog prices. And it's the same where the projected prices are somewhat in the middle. And this matters a lot. This depends a lot on how much is consumed. So for example, chicken has been growing a lot in US consumption over recent decades. Beef has been declining a bit and maybe holding steady, and pork, likewise, not much increase. And the forecast is for not dramatic changes, but somewhat of an increase. So they're not predicting some type of revolution in sustainable diets causing us to radically change where are we getting our protein. They're sort of imagining somewhat more of the same, but we know that that might or might not be the case. So if these are merely projections, not really prognostications, what are the assumptions? We need to, it just ties again, everything in the world is all connected to these questions of sustainable diet. So broad economic growth globally is predicted to be in a middle range, but fairly good, especially in developing countries. Population growth is expected to moderate, right? And so this is what we would expect to see if there's no economic collapse in developing countries and we continue to educate women and girls at higher rates and other things are going well in social change. Energy prices. A lot depends on whether you think currently energy is abundant, right? It's only if you're not looking at the future and thinking about climate change that you think that this can be the long-term situation. And so they predict a moderate increase in energy up to $80 a barrel, but they're not imagining any substantial change in the status quo. And agricultural policy. So the forecast is based on assumption of no change in the actual sort of the policy very much, and we haven't seen a new farm bill yet. And but payments may rise as prices change. So if prices are moderately lower, even under current policy, farm payments go up. And then biofuels. The assumption is, biofuels increase has been a major driver of higher prices in recent decades, and they assume continuing at first to rise further, but then maybe to fall back again somewhat. And trade, the forecast is current trade agreements stay in place. This is also one on which I am not fully counting. And the document has I documented them too hard a time, no mention of climate or warming. And I don't have my notes for the exact quote. I thought maybe I'm being too hard on him. Maybe it's just out of delicacy. You don't quite want to say climate. Maybe you want to use euphemisms. And so I looked up other words like drought to see if drought shows up once in an explanation of how the future events in these assumption variables are not certain. And so there was an acknowledgement of drought once. Not everybody agrees with this reasonably rosy view. For the journal Health Affairs a couple years ago, I reviewed the book by the journalist Joel Bourne, which I don't know if I would have otherwise read. I might have, but it's full of great stories of his visits to farmers in the Ukraine and to places where fish are harvested in the middle of the Pacific, right? And he ends up very concerned about the future of abundance. I'll delicately let the book cover up the recent price declines, because the book is published right where it's located in 2015, and that's you can see the suitability of this book for a time of price spikes. But it's hard to brace yourself both, as we need to do, for both high prices and low prices. in the book, the economist Malthus is a major figure. I learned more about Malthus than I'd known. But at the very end, the journalist goes and visits Bath Abbey, a wonderful place in the UK, looking for the gravesite of Malthus, who's buried there. But he can't find it. It turns out later it was hidden under the pews. And so in a way, the lesson is that Malthus is not yet ready to be resurrected, right? We have to think both about what are the price rises that are possible, but also what are the possibilities of overproduction and low prices that are going to threaten livelihoods for farmers. So what is the lesson? People need to focus not just on wishing for low prices, but on what the fundamental goals is you hope to achieve through low prices, which includes environmental quality, healthy eating, a thriving economy, and low hunger and poverty. And then when your attention turns to prices, let prices be prices. Let them do what they do well. They don't make the whole world better. They just clear quantities and supplies, right? They just clear demand quantities and supply quantities. That's all they do. And it's good for us to let them do that well. And finally, as we think about sustainable diets, both today, tomorrow, and in the long run, pursue a sustainable diet strategy that doesn't assume just one future, but is braced for conditions of both scarcity and abundance. Thanks.